Shunli had always thought he could trust light. A photographer by trade, he'd spent years learning the ins and outs of light, shadow, and how to capture the world in a way that felt like a secret. But this was different. This wasn't photography. This was something he couldn't explain, and frankly, he didn't want to. It had started like any other day, with his eyes half closed to the chaos of the studio. The fluorescent hum of the lights above was his usual soundtrack, the ambient noise of wires and cables stretched across the floors, the click of camera shutters, the mundane details of a day spent pretending he still cared about his craft. But that day was different. He was overseeing a high-intensity light source test for an ad campaign. The tech team had promised the new bulbs would revolutionize the way lighting was used in commercial photography. To Shunli, they were just another gimmick, another fad he had to endure. "Are you sure the voltage is right?" Shunli asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. He glanced over at the technician, a young guy barely old enough to drink, fiddling with a computer connected to the light controls. "Totally," the technician said, not looking up. "The system's calibrated for high-precision testing." Shunli rolled his eyes. High precision. Right. The last time they'd tested something high precision, the studio had almost burned down. But he said nothing. He was tired. His creativity had been drowning in the pool of just another job for the last few months, and today was no different. The test started, and the light flickered. Shunli held up his hand instinctively to shield his eyes. The intensity of the beams made the room feel more like a furnace than a photography studio, and for a moment, everything seemed too bright, too much. But then it wasn't just the light that was overwhelming. In the split second that the light burst across the room, Shunli saw something. A shadow, something that shouldn't have been there, his own reflection, standing not in front of him, but behind him. He blinked. A second passed. No, it wasn't just a shadow. His reflection was moving in real time, but it was wrong. His reflection was still in front of the camera while he was standing near the lights, testing a different angle. "Hey, did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice unsteady for the first time in months. His heart pounded in his chest. But the technician, eyes glued to the screen, didn't answer. There it was again, his reflection, but not quite. His own face in the mirror twisted, changed. For the briefest moment, it was smiling when he wasn't. Then it wavered, like a cracked image on a screen, before settling back into something that almost felt real. The light surged again. This time, he felt it. Something sharp, like a tug at his chest. Then, nothing. He looked around. The room felt oddly empty, but it was the same studio, the same cameras, the same tech people in the background chatting like nothing had happened. But Shunli felt the dissonance in his bones, like a low hum under his skin, an itch he couldn't scratch. His heart thudded in his ears as he walked toward the mirror, his steps unsure. He didn't know why, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from his reflection. Was this some kind of joke? But the longer he stared, the more the air around him felt wrong. The reflection didn't match him. It stood in a place he hadn't been, a moment he hadn't lived. The reflection smiled a little wider, then twisted its mouth into something sinister. "Okay, that's enough," Shunli muttered to himself. He reached out toward the mirror, fingers trembling. When they touched the glass, something shocked him, not with electricity, but with an odd, unfathomable energy. His reflection reached out toward him too, mimicking his motion. Shunli recoiled, his breath quickening. The reflection didn't stop. It was moving like it had a mind of its own, like it knew what he was going to do before he did it. Then, with a sound like a crack splitting the air, he felt himself shift. Everything spun in a disorienting swirl of light, and when the world settled again, he was standing in the corner of the room. But his reflection hadn't moved. It was still standing in front of the camera, perfectly still. "Shunli?" The technician finally turned toward him. "You good?" Shunli didn't answer right away. His mind raced. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he had the distinct feeling he was no longer sure where he was. Was this real? Had he just stepped somewhere else? He blinked a few more times, and when he looked back at the mirror, he saw something strange. His reflection wasn't there anymore. It was gone. Okay, I'm losing it, Shunli muttered, running a hand through his hair. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was stress. Maybe he just needed a break. But when he picked up his camera and checked the photos, his hand froze. On the screen was a picture of himself, standing in the corner of the room. His reflection was still in front of the camera. But what made the image strange, the thing that made Shunli's heart drop, was that the background wasn't the usual white studio space. It wasn't even the space that he'd been standing in. It was something else. Somewhere else. The picture on the camera flickered like a glitch in a computer screen. Shunli's finger hovered over the delete button, but the image didn't disappear. It sat there, mocking him, warping like the shadows on the wall, strange and wrong. No, this isn't happening, he thought. His finger hovered over the button again. But this time, as he pressed down, something shifted. The air rippled, like something was folding in on itself. Suddenly, he wasn't holding a camera anymore. He wasn't even in the room anymore. Where am I? Shunli looked around and blinked. He was standing in the same room. But he wasn't standing there anymore. His image, his entire form, was still frozen at the mirror, looking back at him from the center of the room. It wasn't moving. He could see himself, but it wasn't really him. His reflection was alive. And it was staring at him. Shunli's heart hammered in his chest, his pulse thrumming through his temples. The reflection, his reflection, was not just mimicking his movements anymore. It was staring at him. And not in the way a reflection should. It wasn't passive. It wasn't just a mirror image. This thing, this copy of him, was alive. It blinked, slowly and deliberately, as though it were trying to communicate. Shunli's breath hitched. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He tried to move toward the reflection, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. His own body refused to obey him. It was as though the room had frozen in place, and the world outside of his vision didn't exist. His eyes darted from the image in the mirror to the empty room around him. The reflection's lips moved, barely perceptible at first, as if it were speaking to him, no, through him. Shunli's hands trembled, and he raised his arm to touch the mirror again, as if that might break the illusion, force the reflection to go back to being just a lifeless copy of his movements. But the moment his fingers brushed the cold glass, the reflection did something he could never have anticipated. It smiled. And in the next breath, it stepped out of the mirror. Shunli stumbled backward, his heart skipping a beat. The image, no, the thing, that had once been just a reflection of him now stood in front of him, solid and real. It was exactly like him, but not. The face was his face, the clothes were his clothes, but there was a palpable sense of wrongness. The eyes were too wide, too knowing. The smile was just a bit too perfect, a bit too unsettling. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong in the same world. The reflection, his reflection, tilted its head slightly and grinned wider. "You're not really here, are you?" the thing asked in his voice, but softer, more melodious, almost mocking. Shunli froze, unable to find the words. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound escaped. "You think you've got control over everything, don't you?" The reflection stepped forward, closer and closer, until Shunli could see every detail of his own face, distorted in ways he didn't quite understand. "That's the funny part," it continued, its smile stretching even further. "You think you're the one making the decisions. But you're not. You never were." Shunli's stomach churned. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was paralyzed by the absurdity of it all, as though the entire universe had suddenly collapsed into this single moment. "You're just a ghost," the reflection said, as if it had all the time in the world to savor every word. A memory that's refusing to let go. And now, you're trapped in a world you built for yourself. You think you're still real, don't you? Shun-Li staggered back, his mind struggling to catch up with the surrealness of the situation. Trapped? He wanted to laugh, but the sound stuck in his throat. I don't understand, he stammered, his voice rough. What are you talking about? What do you mean, I'm trapped? You're just, I'm you, the reflection interrupted, its voice cold, unflinching. You built me. Every illusion you've ever created, every light you've ever manipulated, everything you've ever photographed, you made me. Shun-Li's stomach dropped. He staggered back even further, his hands reaching out to steady himself, to find something real, something solid in this godforsaken room. But there was nothing. Just him, and it. The reflection. No, he said, more to himself than to the thing before him. I didn't build you. I didn't, you did, the reflection said, its tone unchanging. You're not who you think you are anymore, Shun-Li. You're not a photographer. You're a creator of worlds. You're a manipulator of light and shadow. And you've been building this place, this thing, inside your head for a long time. It's starting to leak out now, you see? That's why you're here. That's why you can't escape. Shun-Li's vision blurred. He shook his head desperately, trying to clear the fog in his mind. This isn't real, he told himself. This is a trick, some kind of malfunction. Just a weird light glitch. It'll pass. It has to pass. But the reflection didn't pass. It was still standing there, too real, too alive, in the way nothing should be. You're falling apart, Shun-Li, the thing said softly, stepping even closer. You can't control the light anymore. You think you can hide behind your illusions, but they're bleeding into the real world now. And you're the one who built the door that lets them through. Shun-Li backed up into the wall, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He couldn't think. He couldn't make sense of any of it. Stop it, he pleaded. Please. Just stop. I don't know what you want from me. I don't want anything, the reflection interrupted, its voice growing colder. But you do. You want to be more than just a photographer. You want to be something bigger. You want to create, to escape. To be a god. No, Shun-Li said, shaking his head violently. I never asked for this. I just wanted to capture things, to show people what I saw. That's all. You never realized the price, the reflection whispered. It raised one hand and placed it on Shun-Li's chest, and Shun-Li felt an unnatural coldness seep into his skin. It felt like the touch of something long dead, a cold that was colder than any winter night, colder than anything that belonged in the real world. You never realized that when you play with light, when you create worlds, you lose yourself in them. You've already forgotten what's real. The room around him started to bend, the walls flickering in and out of focus, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around him. The air was thick, like he was drowning in it, and every object in the room seemed to shift in and out of shape, like half-remembered dreams. His vision swam, the world around him shimmering like heat rising off a boiling surface. Shun-Li gasped for air, his chest tight, as if the room itself was swallowing him whole. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. This can't be real. This can't be real. The reflection's eyes narrowed, and it tilted its head again, that same, eerie smile never leaving its lips. You're still trying to hold on to it. To this thing you call reality. The reflection stepped closer, until it was so near Shun-Li could feel the heat of its breath on his skin. But you're already lost. You've already become part of your own creation. The air grew thicker, colder. Shun-Li's vision blurred completely, and he stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him. He couldn't stand up straight anymore. He couldn't tell where the floor began or where it ended. The room was dissolving. No. He was dissolving into it. Into the illusion. The light that had once been his tool, his escape, was now pulling him under, consuming him from the inside out. "You're not real anymore," the reflection whispered one last time. Before the world went black, the light flickered again, a pale and sickly glow that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Shun-Li's heart hammered in his chest as his body slowly started to respond again, the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, loosening just enough to allow him a breath. He blinked, disoriented, trying to make sense of where he was. Was this the same place? Was it still the same world? He couldn't tell. All he could focus on was the light, slowly growing brighter, pulling him toward it, beckoning him like a moth to the flame. That he pushed himself to his feet, unsteady at first, as if his legs hadn't quite caught up with the rest of him. He glanced around, nothing. Just the darkness, thick and suffocating. But ahead, the light. His reflection, his own face, floating in the void. He wasn't sure if it was his reflection exactly. It was too distorted, too surreal to be real. It was a projection, something out of sync with the world around him. With every step toward it, the light pulsed, brighter and more insistent, and he could feel a strange sensation creeping up his spine. It was as though he was walking through a heavy fog, something dense, both familiar and foreign, clinging to him. The air smelled different too, tinged with a faint metallic scent, like something burning just out of reach. And then, before he knew it, he was standing at the edge of the light, staring at the reflection that hovered just beyond it. His face grinned back at him, lips stretched unnaturally wide, eyes wide with something he couldn't name. There was no warmth in the gaze, only cold, sharp understanding. He reached out, trembling, and the moment his fingers brushed the edge of the light, it snapped into focus. The world around him shuddered, and the reflection stepped forward, a perfect copy of him, but with eyes that glinted with something darker, something he had never allowed himself to see. It tilted its head, and Shun-Li's breath hitched. His reflection was waiting for him, waiting for something. "You think you can control it," the reflection said, its voice smooth, almost too smooth. "You think you can just step back into the world you used to know, that you can fix what you've broken." Shun-Li swallowed hard, the weight of its words sinking in. Fix? What was broken? Everything felt broken. It had felt broken for a long time, but now it was undeniable. He wasn't even sure where the boundaries of his own mind had gone, or if they'd ever existed at all. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. It didn't matter. The reflection seemed to know exactly what he was thinking, its grin stretching even further, a grotesque parody of his own. "I told you, didn't I?" The reflection's voice was almost affectionate now, but it carried an unmistakable tone of mockery. "You've been hiding behind your lens for so long. Hiding behind your images, your pictures, your creations. You wanted control over everything, over reality. But you don't get to decide what's real anymore. I am the one who controls the light now." Shun-Li's chest tightened. He had no idea how to fight this thing, this version of himself that had somehow emerged from his own mind. This wasn't a mirror anymore. This was a different world altogether, one where the boundaries between light and shadow, between illusion and truth, no longer held any meaning. His hands shook as he reached up, brushing against the reflection again, hoping that touching it might give him some clue, some answer. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him seemed to shift. The air thickened again, the shadows deepened, and suddenly, the reflection was no longer a reflection. It was standing right in front of him. He stumbled back, but the reflection didn't move. It was right there, within arm's reach, its eyes never leaving his. "You think I'm just a shadow, don't you?" the reflection asked, its voice soft but insistent. "But you made me. Every choice you've ever made, every light you've ever bent, every world you've ever shaped, you created me. You gave me life." Shun-Li could feel the walls of his mind closing in on him. He wanted to escape, but the world around him had dissolved into a haze of half-formed images, broken fragments of his own thoughts. Reality itself was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. No, he whispered, his voice thin and unsteady. I didn't create you. You're just a trick. The reflection's smile didn't falter. A trick? That's what you think of me? Do you think your mind is strong enough to keep me at bay? To push me back into the cracks where you think I belong? You made me, Shun-Li. And now you've broken the barrier between the world you created and the world you tried to leave behind. You can't undo what you've done. Shun-Li's knees felt weak. He stumbled again, but this time there was no wall to catch him. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, as if the space around him had just turned into water, drowning him in its oppressive weight. His head spun, the reflection's words echoing in his mind. He had created it, hadn't he? Every illusion, every manipulated light, every piece of the reality he'd sculpted through his lens, it had all led him here. He closed his eyes, desperate to regain control, but the world didn't stop. Instead, it surged forward, flooding his senses, crashing over him in waves. When he opened his eyes again, the room had completely changed. It wasn't the same studio. It wasn't even a room anymore. He was standing on the edge of a vast, endless plain, stretching out in every direction. The sky was dark, swirling with unnatural clouds that glowed faintly, casting a strange, ethereal light on the ground below. The air was thick with a kind of electric tension, as though the very fabric of the world was being pulled in different directions. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, as though they, too, were bending and twisting around him. He looked around frantically, but there was no sign of the reflection. Not at first. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it was standing at the far end of the plain, watching him. Its figure was still and unmoving, but he could feel its presence, like it was right next to him. You see, the reflection's voice came, echoing across the vast emptiness. This is what happens when you create a world and lose control of it. You think you can step in and out of your own mind, shaping the world with light, but you've lost the way back. You've crossed the line. There is no escaping what you've made. Shun-Li's chest constricted, and the weight of the realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been so obsessed with capturing the perfect image, so obsessed with bending light and shadow to his will, that he'd forgotten the most basic thing: he wasn't just photographing the world anymore. He was becoming the world. He had blurred the line between reality and illusion. He had crossed the threshold. And now, he was trapped in the very world he had created, a world that no longer had any rules, no way to distinguish between what was real and what was fabricated. I can't be here, he whispered to himself, but the words sounded hollow, as if they belonged to someone else. This isn't real. The reflection's laugh cut through the air, cold and final. It doesn't matter anymore, Shun-Li. This is real now. All of it. The world you made is the world you live in. And you're the one who built it. You can't run from yourself. Shun-Li tried to move, to escape, but the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift with every step. The horizon warped, the sky swirling around him, trapping him in a never-ending loop of his own making. His breath came faster now, panic clawing at his chest. He could feel the walls of his mind closing in, and yet, there was no escape. No, he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. The reflection didn't answer. It didn't need to, and Shun-Li finally understood. The world he had created, the light and shadow he had bent to his will, had become something more than just a reflection of his desires. It had become his prison. And now, there was no way out. The last thing Shun-Li saw before the world folded in on itself completely was his own reflection, still standing at the far end of the plain, staring back at him with eyes that no longer held any trace of the man he used to be. The reflection was him. And he was lost.